An unprecedented human catastrophe, the battle for Idlib. The Syrian government is adamant it will retake the last rebel-held area. But with Turkey and Russia involved, how will this fight play out across the region? And why does Idlib matter? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. Babies and children are dying of cold in Syria's Idlib, and their suffering has been described by the UN as the biggest humanitarian horror story of the 21st century. It says nearly 900,000 civilians have left since the beginning of December. The Syrian government offensive to capture Idlib has created the biggest single civilian displacement during the 9-year conflict. Despite that, the Syrian President has announced he'll press on with the operation. Idlib is the last remaining rebel stronghold and the only de-escalation zone that remains out of his control. Syrian regime forces are making advances on the ground, and that push has put more pressure on those being displaced. Turkey backs some of the rebels in the province and isn't allowing Syrian refugees to cross its border, saying it can't handle the influx.
We fully understand that this liberation does not mean the end of the war, or the end of plots or terrorism either. This liberation does not mean the enemies will surrender. This liberation means that we put our enemies' pride and nose in the dirt as a primary step to defeat them completely, sooner or later.
Now, in a statement on Monday, the UN's Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, said this: "We're now receiving reports that settlements for displaced people are being hit, resulting in deaths, injuries and further displacement. The biggest humanitarian horror story of the 21st century will only be avoided if UN Security Council members and those with influence overcome individual interests and put a collective stake in humanity first. The only option," he said, "is a ceasefire." Okay, there we are. Here we go. Let's bring in our guests today here on Inside Story. Joining us from Istanbul, Mehmet Çelik, managing editor of the Daily Sabah newspaper. From Beirut, Mohaned Haj Ali, fellow and director of communications at the Carnegie Middle East Center. And joining us from Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist at the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Mehmet Çelik, coming to you first out of Istanbul. We've reached a, quote, new horrifying level in this crisis. Where does the Turkish government think this is heading?
Well, I think it already has had it to a point where it shouldn't have had reached, and that is a humanitarian catastrophe. And Turkey has been vocal about this humanitarian concern since the beginning with regards to Idlib. Where it is heading, I think it will depend on Turkey and Russia negotiations with regards to how far will Assad be will be allowed with regards to Idlib and abiding the Sochi and Astana agreements, particularly with regards to Turkish observation points in the escalation zone, and also, I mean, let alone this relationship with about the observation point posts. But I mean, how far is Putin, Turkey, or the international community will allow Assad to go ahead with this humanitarian catastrophe? I think Turkey has made it very clear with regards to its military steps that it is willing to take in Idlib, and it has announced that it has given Assad time until the end of February. If the observation posts are not cleared by then, I think, and if an agreement hasn't been reached with Russia, then I think the military actions and hard steps will be inevitable against Assad. So, whether Russia will be able to control or is willing to make a compromise with regards to protecting the Sochi deal articles will be determined whether or not Turkey will push forward for that military action. But he has made it very clear, not just in rhetoric, but it also in deployment of its military to de-escalate to the northern Syrian areas close to Idlib, and how much power it is willing to intervene in fight against Assad. I think that will be available by the end of this month.
Okay, Mohaned Hajali in Beirut, do you agree with that analysis that there's got to be a hard response against Bashar al-Assad to do with Idlib, if only because, according to the UN, and I quote, the violence is now indiscriminate? So in that sense, it seems to be a scorched earth policy.
This has been Assad's policy since the very beginning of the conflict. The scorched earth policy has been exactly what he has done in Aleppo before, and also in Homs. This is the Assad's regime modus operandi, along with its allies Russia and Iran and Syria. I think Turkey definitely faces an existential question in regards to the humanitarian crisis. If Assad's forces, supported by Russia, continue to advance, we will see even a worse humanitarian catastrophe, another refugee crisis, which I don't think Turkey is capable of handling. And I think this will have repercussions on the international community, specifically Europe, which had to deal with Turkey a while ago on managing the refugee crisis. I think the next phase is also about maintaining the Turkish-Russian relations. I mean, Russia has invested quite a lot in its leverage against Turkey. Now the trade relations have peaked. The nuclear investment and Russia's role in the building of Turkish nuclear reactors, the Turk Stream gas pipeline is also another massive economic investment. The question is, did Russia consciously build up all of these leverages, all of these economic steps in the past few years since the 2015 incident, consciously built up this leverage against Turkey, so that when they reach this point, that Russia will be better positioned? Because it seems now that it's a one-way concern. Turkey is concerned about its relationship with Russia, and it's this huge patience that we're seeing on the Turkish side, waiting until the end of the month. I don't think they can afford another 10 days of Assad advances against Idlib.
Okay.
This is catastrophic for them. So the question is whether Russia consciously built this leverage against the Turkish side, knowing that they will reach this point in which they will be helpless as they advance against their positions in Idlib.
Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow, presumably with good cause, Turkey is very alarmed looking in on 900,000 people and the price that they are paying. If Turkey wants to go further than it's gone, how will that go down with Mr. Lavrov?
Lavrov is, of course, the Russian foreign minister, but he is not the ultimate decision maker in this situation. The Russian president, of course, Vladimir Putin, is the main architect of the Russian foreign policy. He's very much involved, and Lavrov is sort of his clerk. And also the Russian military are involved in this particular situation. The Assad regime wants to end the civil war by kind of cleansing out the last remaining so-called deconfliction zone, and also maybe pushing a large number of regime opponents out of Syria, and actually shifting the ethnic and religious balance in the country, which was always their idea. Of course, this is not what Putin is really interested in, but the Russian military have their own agenda to some extent. They also want an end to the civil war in Syria, and they want to be more involved in other things that actually really led them to Syria, like standing off against NATO in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay, but Pavel,
So
surely
these
you
are
would accept, just
pressures
interrupt you
that are
there for a
put
second and to
up,
stop
and
you for a
they are
second, if I may.
on the pragma
You would
too.
accept that Mr. Lavrov, however, yes, okay, he doesn't call the shots, that's
Yes.
down to Mr. Putin, but Mr. Lavrov does shape foreign policy. He has shaped what's gone on in Astana as well. I mean, if only because he's now on record as saying attacks on Russian bases cannot be tolerated. What does that mean?
Well, that means that the Russian base in Khmeimim is a strategic asset, It's not even about Syria. It's about the Russian naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the air cover for the Russian presence. There's also, of course, a Russian naval base in Tartus. And the Khmeimim base is too close to the Idlib zone. There have been some kind of not very effective, but still attacks using homemade drones against that base. Some of these attacks some time ago were successful, and the Russian military say that they have to have this base fully secure. The opposition should be cleansed out. And Lavrov is relaying that message, with which the Kremlin, of course, concurs. Though the present situation, when Turkey and Russia are on a collision course, or I would say drifting towards slowly towards a collision, is not really what Mr. Putin, as the architect of Russian foreign policy, really wanted or wants.
Okay. Let's go back to Mehmet Çelik in Istanbul. If we go back 18 months, Mehmet, we were talking about de-escalation zones on this channel, on this program indeed, as well. De-escalation zones, can I suggest to you, they clearly do not work because you can't police them. You can't guarantee that people, whether they've been to Astana, whether they've been to Geneva 1 to 5 or not, doesn't matter. They don't do what they say they will do when it comes to those de-escalation zones. And after 18 months ago, we saw hundreds of people losing their lives.
Well, I mean, it is true. They work better on paper than on practice. But I think it has a lot to do with the motivations and genuinity and sincerity of the parties that are signing these agreements. You know, if we look at these de-escalation zones, for example, or the observation points with Sochi deal, or in general with the ceasefires that were agreed recently in Idlib, we see that, okay, on paper they agree on something and mainly the motivation behind these agreements is humanitarian and civilian concerns. But then we see that, you know, in the name of fighting against terror, hospitals are being bombed. Children and women are being killed. Like the previous speaker said, there is a sort of demographic changes being implemented. Ethnic and religious demographics are changed, and millions of people are being displaced. So the motivations are not necessarily matching these agreements that are signed on paper. The de-escalation zone, in theory, I think it would have been successful if Assad didn't continue its attack on Idlib, for example, in the name of fighting against some terrorist groups that Turkey and Russia agreed on, calling them terrorists. They bomb children, they bomb civilians, they bomb hospitals and other community spaces instead of fighting against terrorism. And I think this also delegitimizes these efforts for a political transition between Turkey, Russia, and Iran. But now, do we say that, okay, just because it didn't work, now Turkey should push forward for a hard military?
Mehmet, I'm going to pause you there as well, if I may, because I want to kind of boil that down and take that point to Mohammed Haji Ali in Beirut. Mohammed, at the end of last year, people were saying the conflict in Syria is entering its end game. That was being said by various analysts around about mid to late December. Can we still say that?
Definitely not. I mean, you have on the military side, of course, the regime is advancing against Turkey-backed positions in Idlib and other regions. But at the same time, you know, you still have the U.S. protected zone, and also you have the economic situation, which is deteriorating. And we're seeing, you know, some forms of protest here and there. And so it seems that the contentious politics in Syria is still alive and will continue given the regime's failure in running its own affairs and, you know, continuing the same old policies of authoritarianism and repression on the ground. But at the same time, just to go back to the regional politics in all of this. You know, while Turkey is patient in handling this affair, given the extent of Russian-Turkish relations, you know, it seems that this deadline is quite real, and I think the next phase will see some form of Turkish escalation, given the repercussions if the Assad regime is to hold and keep these regions. And if Russia, let's say, for instance, and that's another scenario which might also occur, if Russia does not allow Turkey or agrees with Turkey on some sort of an attack on Kurdish held positions, to the east, if Turkey expands its protected zone westwards towards Kurdish position after an agreement with Russia and perhaps with the United States, this will allow Erdogan to present this as some sort of quid pro quo kind of agreement, a give and take agreement, like the ones that happened in the past, in which they swapped battlefields in return for expanding the Turkish zone and the Turkish plans for returning refugees into that zone.
Okay, Pavel, in Moscow, on that idea of Bashar al-Assad being allowed to run his own affairs, seems to me that as far as Idlib is concerned, Moscow doesn't want to relinquish its undoubtedly big amount of leverage that it has with Damascus. But on the other hand, it doesn't want to use that leverage with Damascus. Why not?
First of all, the Assad regime has a degree of autonomy. It's not just Russian-backed, it's also very much Iranian-backed. And Iran is providing actually more support, most likely, if you take the net weight, to say, in money terms, and in the number of forces on the ground, the Iranian-led and organized Shia militias. So they have their own leverages. They're not kind of direct. Assad is not a direct vassal of Moscow. And Moscow has its own agenda, which is kind of more global, or at least more regional, and it's more aimed not into Syria, but out of Syria into the Mediterranean, where, of course, there's other things. There's the Libyan situation, and there's just a hot report coming in with the Haftar announcing that they sunk a Turkish ship, apparently, with arms supplies coming to Tripoli. And there in Libya, there are also the Russians and the Turks seem to be supporting opposing sides. And this is also going to be part of the possible negotiations that right now are happening in Moscow, of course, on the level of just deputy foreign ministers heading the delegations. But as the Kremlin said, if there's going to be some kind of quid pro quo breakthrough, apparent, there could be a quickly organized summit, maybe another one in Sochi between Erdogan and Putin, to try and make some kind of quid pro quo involving Syria, possibly involving Libya, and involving Idlib. The other alternative is a collision between these powers, which no one really wants, but it's not easy to avert.
Mohamed Haji Ali in Beirut, is Idlib significant, just to go back to basics for a second, is Idlib significant because Idlib was the most vociferous vessel of hatred of the Bashar al-Assad regime?
I mean, yes, Idlib was part of the 1980s uprising against the Assad regime. And yes, Idlib was one of the centers of the uprising against the Assad regime. But having said that, I would say, it's important now regionally because of the refugee crisis. You have refugees living in Idlib, refugees from other regions, which were pushed also by the Assad regime advance. And they're now in Idlib, and definitely this will have consequences on the Turkish side. Just a small remark about the Libya conflict and its relationship to Syria. It's quite symbolic that now alongside Haftar there are pro-regime militias, pro-Assad regime militias fighting Syrians, fighting alongside Haftar's regime, and also on the other side, on the Turkish-backed side, there are Turkish-backed rebels who were moved from Syria into the Libyan battlefield. Syrians are fighting each other not only in Syria but also in Libya, using through these two powers, which have quite some leverage on who fights where and for what reason, and for advancing their own interests in these two countries.
Okay.
But as you said, Idlib is symbolic, and I think if Idlib is lost, this will have quite a huge significance on who won the Syrian conflict.
Mehmet Çelik in Istanbul, on that idea of who won the Syrian conflict or who has yet to win the Syrian conflict, in inverted commas, Bashar al-Assad is saying he will be victorious. Do you get the sense where you are that Syria and Turkey are prepared to go to war over Syria or over Idlib?
I think the public sentiment, and even if we were to put Erdogan and the government aside, there is a huge public sentiment against Bashar Assad and what Russia is doing. And I think that sentiment combined with the atrocities happening in Idlib, combined with the wave of a new big wave of refugees, I think there is a willingness to even push for that, to stop that particular wave of refugees coming into Syria. So despite this nationalistic or this militaristic tone in the against Assad coming from the government, there is also a public sentiment that supports that, and that's also interesting for the Turkish public when it comes to Syrian conflict. I think Idlib has turned into an existential place for Turkish intervention into Syria or Turkey's operation in Syria, because what will come after Assad claims victory in Idlib and it takes control of Idlib? Will he be stopping there, or the next target will be now the northern Syrian areas under the control of the moderate opposition backed by Turkey? Okay. So there's all these things that needs to be considered to analyze why Turkey is also pushing for a de-escalation in Idlib.
Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow, coming back to you for a second. Does what's going on in Idlib right now negate the need for a compromise from 2 points? Point number one, purely from a military stance, but point number two as well. Russia has to pressure Damascus to pull a plug on what it's doing. Otherwise, reconstruction aid will not come through. So therefore, if Damascus doesn't react well to any potential Russian pressure, why wouldn't Syria and Turkey go to war over Idlib?
Well, the Syria and Turkey going to war per se, that won't be much of a war, because what's left of the Syrian Arab army is no match for the Turkish army. So the real equation is Turkey and Russia. There's no real appetite in both sides to go on a head-on collision, but finding a compromise is also very tricky. Or you can kind of theorize something like, say, the Assad forces partially withdrawing, replaced by Russian military police instead, which would leave the M5 and M4 highways from Latakia to Aleppo and from Damascus to Aleppo open for traffic. But still the Assad forces will step back from the main refugee camps. Something can be kind of put together, but will that compromise be reached? And more importantly, there were compromises reached before, but they didn't stick. They didn't hold. They held maybe for a short time, but then again there was this slow advance of pro-regime forces. So is there a compromise at all available, and will it hold? Or there's going to be some kind of first deep crisis between Moscow and Ankara, and then they're going to find a solution afterwards, after the dust settles. Right now, it's very hard to guess.
And with that, that's the end of Inside Story for another day. Thanks to all our guests, Mehmet Çelik, Mohamed Harjali and Pavel Felgenhauer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by going to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also talk to us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story. And I'm @PeterDobby1. From me, Peter Dobby, and everyone on the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. See you soon.